The movie begins by showing the atmosphere of the night in Chicago at the end of 2016, which was chaotic because of the high crime rate after the free circulation of firearms. That night, the police again received reports of criminal acts, so they pursued the perpetrators of these crimes. Meanwhile, a man who was a victim of the crime was rushed to the hospital to get help. With the victim's serious condition, the medical team took the victim to the operating room to be treated by Paul Kersey, a surgeon at a Chicago hospital known as a Family Man. Because the victim had lost a lot of blood, Paul could not save the man. He looked very disappointed because his patient could not be saved. Then he met the police officer to inform him that the victim was not safe. As a surgeon, Paul can't do much with the high crime rate in the city and only hopes that the police can handle it. One day, Paul was seen having breakfast with his wife, Lucy Kersey, and his college-age daughter, Jordan Kersey, who had just been accepted at Northwestern University, one of the best campuses in America. Paul and his wife seemed proud of their daughter, who will be studying at the university. To celebrate this, the three of them had lunch at a restaurant with Paul's younger brother, Frank Kersey. Frank is known as a man who is extravagant and often relies on Paul to meet all his needs. As lunch was over, he expressed his intention to borrow money from Paul before he finally left the restaurant. Paul seemed to agree to that request. Not long after, the valet parking attendant named Brian came over to Paul, and Paul gave him his car keys and car parking ticket. Unexpectedly, Brian, who had gotten into the car, took a photo of Paul's travel history so that he knew the address of Paul's family's house because he had previously heard the conversation about going out on Paul's birthday night. So Brian intends to rob Paul's house when his house is empty to take everything freely. On the eve of Paul's birthday, Paul and his family are getting ready to celebrate the birthday party. Suddenly, he gets a call from the hospital because an emergency patient must be operated on. Paul, who is very responsible for his profession, was forced to postpone the plan and went to the hospital. However, Lucy and Jordan looked disappointed that their family's plans failed that night. Because of that, they decided to shop for some groceries to prepare dinner together after Paul came home from the hospital. As Lucy and Jordan returned home with all their groceries, they started cooking. Suddenly, three masked robbers sneaked into the house, holding them both captive. Not wanting to hurt them, the robbers asked Lucy to show them where their family's valuables were kept. When a mugger went with her to retrieve the valuables, two other robbers were guarding Jordan in the kitchen. However, one of the robbers guarding her seduces her despite being warned by the other robbers. Jordan felt unacceptable, so she took a knife from the table to attack the robber. The robber, who was very angry because of the attack, took off his mask and pointed a gun at her. Other robbers tried to prevent the action because their goal was to go to the house only to take valuables, not to injure or kill the occupants. At the same time, Lucy, brought back to the kitchen, tried to take advantage of this opportunity to douse the robber with hot water she had previously prepared for cooking and asked Jordan to save herself. The robber, who did not want his action to fail, finally shot them before they fled. On the other hand, Paul is still busy operating on emergency patients. Not long after he finished the operation, he received another emergency call to treat two patients who had just arrived at the hospital. He was very surprised to learn that the two patients in question were his wife and daughter, who received gunshot wounds after being attacked by robbers. He looked even sadder when he saw that his wife did not survive the attack because the robber shot Lucy in the chest. Meanwhile, Jordan had to receive intensive care after she received shrapnel around the head that put her in a coma. Moments later, a policeman questions Paul about various valuables in the safe. Paul, who is sad, reveals some of his valuables in the form of family documents, $2,000 that he will lend to Frank, a ring, and a watch that was a gift for his birthday from Lucy. The next day, Paul takes care of Jordan, who still hasn't woken up from the coma, before he leaves her to take Lucy's body buried in her hometown. After Lucy's funeral, Paul left the burial site with Wendell, Lucy's father. On the way, Wendell suddenly stopped his car after seeing poachers messing around on his farm. He took his rifle and tried to shoot the poacher's car even though his aim was always missed. His old condition does not make him afraid of facing people who try to take away his things. Paul, who saw that, began to realize that at this time, it was as if the police were no longer needed because every man had to act alone to protect everything they owned. Since he met with Wendell, Paul has felt guilty because he couldn't take good care of his wife and daughter, especially since the robbery had killed his wife. He seemed disappointed with the police's slow performance in investigating the robbery and murder cases that befell his family. When Paul met Detective Kevin Rains, who was handling the case, he saw a series of criminal cases being handled by Kevin, so he had to stand in line so that the case could be handled by the police. Because Paul wants the case to be over quickly, he reveals that he will use the services of a private investigator to help Kevin find the perpetrators of the robbery and Lucy's murder. However, Kevin doesn't seem to agree with that idea and tries to dissuade Paul from doing it. Knowing this, he was even more disappointed with the police. At night, when Paul was passing through a slum area in the city of Chicago, he defended a woman who was being harassed by a group of thugs, which caused him to be badly beaten after being beaten up by the thugs. Paul, who felt he could no longer rely on the police, finally went to a firearms shop. Arriving at the store, Paul was greeted by a female salesperson who explained that owning firearms in America is very easy, especially for those with money. Even so, he finally decided not to buy firearms because he was still thinking about the penalties for illegally possessing firearms. One day, Paul got a patient with a gunshot wound to his body, and when a gun fell from the patient's shirt pocket, he deliberately hid it until finally, he took the gun out of the room after he finished treating the patient. After returning home from work, Paul, who felt that he had to move on his own to uncover the case of Lucy's death, secretly began to study how the gun he had just gotten worked. With his intelligence, he could master the gun in a very short time. In the morning, Paul returned to visit Jordan to see how she was. When he saw that her condition was weakening, he was increasingly convinced to demand justice for his family in his own way without waiting for the authorities to move. At night, Paul, who was wearing a hoodie and carrying his gun, went to a slum area known to have a high crime rate. He looks down the streets in the area and sees a robbery taking place, so he shouts at the robbers. The robbers, who took action using a car, tried to crash into him so that he reflexively dodged and injured his left wrist. Paul, who did not want to let go of the robbers, ran away, took a gun, and shot the car being driven by the robbers until it overturned and hit a roadside pillar. Not long after, the robbers who survived aimed fire at Paul, and luckily he dodged and hid behind a car parked nearby. They were shooting at each other until finally, Paul could shoot all the robbers dead. Not wanting his identity to be known, Paul left the place and threw away his hoodie. However, a woman named Bethany, who was not far from the scene, had recorded all of his actions. Moments later, the police arrived to secure the place. Kevin and his assistant named Leonore Jackson asked for statements from the victims of the robbery and witnesses who thought that the actions Paul had taken were heroic actions that had saved the victims. Even he was considered the angel of death by the witnesses who gave statements to the police. Bethany, who was questioned, provided a recording showing Paul's actions when he thwarted the robbery. When they saw the video, Kevin and Leonore realized that the person who did the heroic act was not used to using firearms. Meanwhile, Paul, who had just killed another person for the first time, seemed quite nervous and tried to calm down. While treating his sprained left hand, he saw the news on the internet showing videos of his heroic actions had been spread. He felt happy and gained more confidence after knowing that many people praised the stunt call and addressed him as the angel of death. He was even amazed by the action he had just performed when facing the robbers. A few days later, Paul returned to his work at the hospital. On that day, he had to treat a child patient named Tyler, who received a serious gunshot wound to his body. Then he met Tyler and asked about the shooting that happened. Tyler revealed that he was forced to work for a drug dealer in the area where he lived. He revealed that the drug dealer who shot him had disguised himself as an ice cream seller to distribute the drugs. Paul, who heard the explanation from him, became very annoyed and planned to attack the drug dealer. It didn't take long for Paul to find the drug dealer that Tyler had told him about. When visiting an ice cream seller suspected of being a drug dealer, Paul shot the seller and all of his men. After completing the action, Paul left the place and ensured he didn't leave any traces. With his actions, the public is increasingly busy discussing the figure who is considered a hero. Even many television media are broadcasting his action. The debate about vigilante action has started to be widely discussed and reap pros and cons from society. The police, represented by Kevin and Leonore, were then urged to investigate all of Paul's actions. A few days later, Paul returned to treat a patient with a gunshot wound so the hospital could perform surgery. When he came to save the critical patient, he saw the patient wearing his watch, which was robbed. Then Paul realized that the patient was Brian, a valet he had met at a restaurant. Unfortunately, his life could not be saved because he had lost so much blood that Paul lost one of the clues to uncover Lucy's murder. Paul, who did not give up on finding other evidence, went to the ambulance that was used to take Brian to the hospital. Then he found a cell phone belonging to Brian. At night, Paul, who had found a bar address in Brian's cell phone, went to the bar, which was a place where stolen goods were collected. Arriving at the bar, he shot all the criminals who tried to attack him. Paul forces a criminal to tell him about the robbery and murder that killed Lucy. After Paul got information about one of his house robbers named Joe, he went to a repair shop owned by Joe. Without further ado, he asked about Lucy's killer to Joe, who was busy fixing the car. From Joe's confession, Knox was the one who had shot Lucy and Jordan, and he didn't know Knox well, so he couldn't tell Paul where Knox lived. Shortly after Paul got the information, he killed Joe. One night, while Paul is looking after Jordan, who is still in hospital, he gets a call from an unknown number, so he ignores it. Not long after, a message from the number appeared. Paul realized that the message was from Knox asking him to pick up the phone. After Knox told him to meet them at a bar, he rushed to the bar. Shortly after, Paul called Knox again after he arrived at the bar, and finally, Paul met him in the bar toilet. Then they shot at each other until both of them were injured by being shot. Knox, who was shot in the stomach, then went to the hospital where Paul worked for treatment. He reveals Paul's involvement, the Grim Reaper who kills criminals. Meanwhile, Paul tries to mend a laceration on his right shoulder in the barn at his house. When he returned to the living room, he was surprised by Frank, who had come some time before. Frank knows what his older brother did, so he tries to remind Paul of what he did wrong. But Paul explains that he did all of this to uphold justice, which he never got from the police. After the debate, Frank finally understood the reason for him doing this, so Frank tried to protect Paul when Kevin and Leonore came to the house looking for him. The next day, Jordan's condition, which had improved, was finally allowed to go home from the hospital. While Paul is in the elevator, they meet Knox, who has just been released after receiving treatment for a previous gunshot wound. Seeing Knox's presence, Paul realized that he and Jordan were in danger because Knox would target them. Therefore, not long after he dropped Jordan off at home, Paul went to a shop that sold firearms to get some firearms. At night, Knox and some of his men sneak into Paul's house as he had previously suspected. Paul, who knew about this, asked Jordan to hide in a cupboard under the stairs and told her to contact the police. At the same time, Paul, in his new armor, starts attacking any intruders who enter the house. After that, he shoots Knox in the arm, so Knox plans to burn down his house before he escapes. Suddenly, Knox heard a voice behind the cupboard under the stairs where Jordan was hiding. Knox, who knew Paul had hidden Jordan there, headed towards the sound and planned to kill her. But Paul tried to take advantage of this opportunity to shoot Knox using his rifle, and he was finally defeated. Moments later, the police, called Jordan, came to Paul's house. In front of Kevin, Paul said he was trying to defend himself from Knox and his men, who had sneaked into the house, so he had to kill them. Even though Kevin knew that Paul had killed other criminals before, he still thanked Paul for eradicating criminals in Chicago. At the end of the movie, Paul accompanies Jordan to an apartment that she would occupy in New York to pursue her education. On the way home, Paul accidentally saw a man stealing a bag on the street, and he raised his finger as if he was going to shoot the thief. The moral that can be learned from this movie is that we must be brave to protect the things that are valuable to us before they are taken away by others.